August 30, 1942. Late afternoon. A ridge called Alam Halfa, in the Egyptian desert southeast of El Alamein, Erwin Rommel sat in his command vehicle writing a letter to his wife, Lucy, back in Germany. He wasn't writing about victory. He was writing about fear, a specific, calculated fear that only a general who has run out of easy options actually feels. He told her, "I have worried so much about this day, but I am taking the risk because I will not have another chance. In terms of the moonlight and ratio of forces, so much is at stake." That letter survives. It's part of the documented record historians now call the Rommel Papers, and it tells you everything about the state of mind of the most feared tank commander in the German army on the night his luck in North Africa finally ran out. To understand why this one night matters more than almost any other in the Desert War, you need to understand who was waiting for him on that ridge. A division that, by August 1942, already carried a nickname the enemy had learned to take seriously. The British 7th Armoured Division had been formed in Egypt back in 1938, originally called the Mobile Division, built to defend the Suez Canal against exactly the kind of threat Italy and later Germany would bring. Its insignia became a small desert rodent called a jerboa. The story goes that the division's first commander, Major General Percy Hobart, took a liking to a pet jerboa he saw at a desert camp and adopted it as the unit's symbol. By 1940, the division had a new name to go with the badge, the Desert Rats. They'd already fought Italian forces in Operation Compass in the winter of 1940 into 1941. And they'd already fought the Afrika Korps directly at places like Sidi Rezeg and Gazala earlier in 1942. Battles that hadn't gone Britain's way. Rommel had beaten them before. He had every operational reason to believe he could do it again. Before I tell you what happened when he tried, one quick thing. Wars like this one aren't abstract history to a lot of people watching. They're family history. So, if you've got a moment, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. I read every single one, and it's a big part of why this channel keeps digging into stories like this. Now, back to the ridge. By late August 1942, Rommel's situation had become genuinely desperate, and the record on this is unusually precise because his own logistics staff kept careful count. He had asked the Italian High Command in Rome for 6,000 tons of fuel and 2,500 tons of ammunition before he could risk this attack. By August 29, more than half the supply convoys sent from Italy had been sunk by Allied aircraft and submarines, and barely 1,500 tons of fuel had actually reached Tobruk. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring eventually agreed to loan Rommel some Luftwaffe fuel reserves just to get the attack moving at all. Enough, by the most careful estimate, for about 150 miles per vehicle for his troops and 250 miles for his support vehicles. That is not a comfortable margin in open desert. That is a general betting his entire army on being fast enough that the math never has to matter. His plan, codenamed Unternehmen Brandung, Operation Surf, was simple in concept and brutal in its demands. Italian infantry divisions would pin the British line in a frontal demonstration to the north, while the real strike force for German 15th and 21st Panzer divisions, along with Italian armor, would punch through what Rommel believed was a lightly held 13-mile gap in the southern sector, then race northeast under cover of darkness to seize the high ground at Alam Halfa before the sun came up. 50 kilometers in one night, through unmapped minefields in the dark. What Rommel didn't know. Because British codebreakers reading German Enigma traffic through the Ultra program had already told Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery almost exactly where and when the blow was coming, was that the gap wasn't an oversight, it was bait. And the men who'd been placed to cover the minefields directly in Rommel's path, with simple orders to inflict maximum casualties on his tanks before falling back, were the 7th Motor Brigade and 4th Armoured Brigade of the 7th Armoured Division. The Desert Rats were exactly where Montgomery wanted them. And at sundown, under a full moon that Rommel had specifically chosen to light his tank's path, east the Afrika Korps began to move. August 30, 1942. Roughly 10 p.m., the southern minefields below Alam Halfa. The plan called for speed. What the Afrika Korps got instead was chaos, and it started almost immediately Rommel's armor moved into the minefield belt, expecting a narrow, thin obstacle his engineers could clear within an hour or two. Instead, they found the British defenses far deeper and far better sewn than German intelligence had assessed. Combat engineers worked by hand in the dark, lifting mines under fire while Royal Air Force bombers, tipped off by ultra-intercepts to almost exactly where and when the attack was coming, found the stalled columns lit up by their own vehicle exhaust, and the bright full moon Rommel had chosen specifically to help his tanks navigate. Fallen. Wellington bombers worked the traffic jam for hours. Men who had fought through Poland, France, and the earlier desert campaigns without ever facing sustained night bombing were now sitting still in open ground, unable to move forward or back, while bombs walked down the length of the column. By the time the leading German tanks finally broke clear of the minefields, it was midday on August 31, 12 to 14 hours behind Rommel's schedule. That delay would turn out to be the single most expensive cost of the entire battle, because it meant the Afrika Korps was no longer moving through darkness toward an undefended flank. It was now moving in daylight, low on fuel, directly toward a British defensive line that had spent all night watching them come, and covering that minefield belt the whole time, inflicting exactly the kind of running, harassing losses their orders called for, then pulling back before they could be pinned down and destroyed themselves, were the 2 brigades of the 7th Armoured Division. Not a set-piece stand. A deliberate, disciplined bleeding of Rommel's spearhead, mile by mile, mine by mine, fought in the dark. The cost to the German command structure that night and the following day was severe enough to be historically documented by name. General Walther Neyring, commanding the Afrika Korps itself, was wounded in one of the RAF's air raids on the stalled column. General Georg von Bismarck, commanding the 21st Panzer Division, was killed by a mortar round while his tanks sat exposed in the minefield's aftermath. These were not junior officers. This was Rommel losing his corps commander and a divisional commander within the first day of an operation that was supposed to be over in one night. On the evening of August 31, with his tanks strung out, exposed, and burning fuel he could not replace, Rommel's own chief of staff, Fritz Bayerlein, suggested pulling both panzer divisions back from contact entirely and swinging wide to outflank a key position from a different angle. It was, on paper, the correct tactical answer. It was also impossible. Later assessments of the German fuel logs from that day found barely a quarter of a fuel unit remaining for the tanks, and less than half a unit for the wheeled transport carrying their supplies. There wasn't enough fuel left in the entire attacking force to drive the distance the plan required. Rommel had no real choice left. He turned his tanks north, directly toward the high ground of Alam Halfa itself, the exact ridge and the exact prepared defensive line that Montgomery had built specifically to receive him. By evening on September 1, the leading elements of the Afrika Korps were approaching that ridge with their fuel nearly gone, their commanding general wounded, one of their 2 Panzer Division commanders dead, and an entire night and day of losses behind them that Rommel had never budgeted for. Waiting on the ridge itself were dug-in British tanks under new explicit orders from Montgomery. Hold position, use the tanks as anti-tank guns, rather than charging out to meet the German armor in the open, and let Rommel's exhausted, fuel-starved panzers come to them. Friedrich von Mellenthin, a German staff officer who lived through those days and later wrote one of the most respected first-hand accounts of the Desert War, Panzer Battles, described the Afrika Korps in this exact stretch of the fight as paralyzed, tanks sitting in the open, out of fuel, under constant bombardment, simply waiting for a British counterattack that everyone on the German side assumed was coming and would finish them where they sat. It never came. Not the way they expected. And what Rommel actually said out loud during those frozen, exposed hours, a single sentence of pure frustration, aimed not at the men in front of him, but at the general he could not understand, is the line that history remembers best from the entire battle. September 1, 1942. Alam Halfa Ridge. Rommel watched his own tanks sit motionless in the open desert, out of fuel, waiting for a British armoured counterattack that never arrived. And it was in that exact window of frozen, exposed helplessness that he said the sentence historians still quote from this battle. frustrated that Montgomery wouldn't send his tanks charging out to finish off the stranded Afrika Korps in the open, where German gunnery and experience might still have turned the tables. Rommel turned to Field Marshal Kesselring and said simply, "The swine isn't attacking." It's a strange thing to say about the man who is winning, but it tells you exactly what was happening. Rommel's entire method of war, for 2 years, across Libya and Egypt, had depended on drawing British armour into the open and destroying it there, where speed and gunnery mattered more than defensive lines. Montgomery, new to command and working from ultra-intelligence that told him almost exactly what Rommel intended to do, refused to play that game. He kept his tanks dug in on the ridge, using them as fixed anti-tank guns rather than a mobile strike force, and simply let the Afrika Korps burn through the fuel it no longer had. By September 2nd, with his panzer divisions stalled below Alam Halfa, his fuel reserves essentially exhausted, his corps commander wounded, and a divisional commander dead, Rommel made the decision that ended the battle. He ordered a withdrawal back toward his starting positions. The retreat wasn't a rout. Rommel's forces conducted it in reasonably good order, and Montgomery, still cautious about wasting his own newly rebuilt armour on a pursuit through unfamiliar minefields, chose not to press the withdrawal into a full destruction of the Afrika Korps. By September 5, 1942, the battle was effectively over. The line hadn't moved. Rommel held no new ground, and for the first time since he'd arrived in North Africa in February 1941, his signature style of warfare, the fast, punishing armoured gamble that had beaten the British again and again at places like Gazala just months earlier, had simply failed to work. The cost was concentrated but unmistakable. 2 German generals lost in the space of 2 days, 1 wounded, 1 dead. Fuel reserves that had been calculated down to fractions of a unit, burned away in a single stalled advance through minefields the Afrika Korps had been told would take an hour to clear, and instead took most of a night and a full day. And an armoured division, the desert rats, that had held its ground, bled the German advance mile by mile through the minefield belt exactly as ordered, then watched from a fixed defensive ridge as the most feared armoured force in North Africa ran out of road, ran out of fuel, and ran out of options in front of them. Historians don't call Alam Halfa a dramatic victory. There was no great breakthrough, no map redrawn overnight. What changed was quieter, and in the long run, far more decisive. Rommel never launched another major offensive in North Africa again. The initiative that had belonged to the Afrika Korps since Rommel's arrival in the desert passed permanently to the British 8th Army. 6 weeks later, at the Second Battle of El Alamein, beginning October 23, 1942, Montgomery would go on the attack himself, and the 7th Armoured Division, the same desert rats who had bled Rommel's tanks through the minefields at Alam Halfa, would be there again, this time driving forward instead of holding a line. Von Mellenthin, the German staff officer who lived through those frozen, fuel-starved hours below the ridge, would later write that the battle marked the moment the German command in North Africa understood something it hadn't fully accepted before. That the 8th Army it now faced, and the Armoured Division holding the ground in front of it, was no longer the force that had broken at Gazala a few months earlier. It had learned. It had been rebuilt. And on the night of August 30, 1942, under a full moon, Rommel had chosen to light his own path to victory, for it simply refused to break. Rommel's own words to his wife before the attack began, that he was taking a risk because the moonlight and the ratio of forces would never align this well again, turned out to be more accurate than he could have known. He was right that this was his last real chance. He was wrong about what waited for him on the other side of that minefield. If stories like this, the real numbers, the real dates, the real cost behind a single turning point, are what keep you watching, that's exactly the kind of history this channel is built to dig up. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. I read everyone.